It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after chaos when the smoke still hangs in the air and the ground smells of burned metal. Somewhere deep in a war-torn valley, a Marine named Jack Colton opened his eyes to a world that looked like it had ended. The blast had thrown him across a ditch, his ears ringing, his body heavy with dirt. He tried to move, but pain shot through his shoulder. He blinked through the haze, trying to remember what happened. The convo. The ambush. The radio call that never went through. And then the explosion. Jack pushed himself up, ignoring the sting in his arm. The night was torn apart by small fires and the flicker of tracer rounds in the distance. His unit, his brothers, had been hit hard. Somewhere out there, they were still alive. They had to be. He steadied his breathing. The sky above was a dark sheet, full of smoke and stars. He could hear faint shouting, then nothing. Just wind. Just fear. But underneath it all, something inside him said, "Move." He grabbed his rifle, checked the magazine, and started crawling through the wreckage. Every inch forward felt like moving through fire. He found one of the Humvees on its side, burning slow. The smell of fuel mixed with blood. He called out softly, his voice rough. "Mason? You there?" A groan answered him. He followed it, and found a Marine half buried under debris. Mason's leg was twisted, his helmet cracked. Jack pulled him free, dragged him behind a half-broken wall. "You're gonna be okay," Jack whispered, even though he wasn't sure. Mason coughed, eyes half open. "Where's the rest?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't know. The radio on his vest crackled faintly, but no voice came through. The command post was miles away, and the signal was gone. He looked around, only fire and shadows. He had two choices: wait and hope for rescue, or go find the others. He chose the second. Jack bandaged Mason's leg as best he could and pressed a pistol into his hand. "Stay low. Don't move unless you have to. I'll be back." Mason grabbed his wrist. "You can't go alone." Jack gave him a look. "I already am." He turned and vanished into the dark, moving low between wrecks and broken ground. Every sound was magnified: the creak of his gear, the crunch of sand beneath his boots, the distant echo of enemy voices. His heart pounded, but his mind was calm. Years of training turned fear into focus. He reached the edge of the valley and looked down. Below, enemy flashlights flickered through the dust. He could see bodies, some American, some not. He swallowed hard, forcing down the guilt. His brothers were out there, alive or dead. And until he knew for sure, he wasn't leaving. He took a breath and whispered to himself, "One step at a time." Then he descended into the valley. 4 hours he moved through ruins and smoke, searching. He found 2 more Marines, one wounded, one gone. He carried the wounded man on his back for half a mile to the nearest cover. His body screamed, but his will didn't break. When the sun began to rise, the valley looked even worse. Bodies, vehicles, silence. But there were footprints leading deeper into the canyon. American boots. Fresh. He felt a spark inside him. Someone was still alive. He picked up the pace, pushing past exhaustion. The sun burned, the air dry and cruel. His canteen was half empty, but he didn't stop. Each step felt heavier than the last, but his mind kept replaying the same image: his team's faces before the blast. The laughter, the plans, the bond only soldiers understood. He wasn't walking through a battlefield anymore. He was walking through a promise. By midday, he reached a small ravine with burned trees and a stream trickling through ash. He knelt, splashed water on his face, and let the cold sting bring him back. That's when he heard a faint cough from behind a boulder. He froze, raised his rifle, and circled slowly. Behind the rock lay Corporal Diaz, bruised and shaking, trying to reload a jammed weapon. When he saw Jack, relief washed over his face. "Sir? I thought I was the last one." Jack knelt beside him. "Not yet." Diaz's eyes filled with tears he didn't want to show. "They took Wilson. Alive. Dragged him east." Jack clenched his jaw. Then that's where we're going. He looked out toward the eastern ridge, where smoke curled up into the sky like a warning. His body was already trembling from exhaustion, but his mission was clear. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was bringing his brothers home no matter how far into hell he had to walk. And that's how the longest 48 hours of his life began. The heat came early that morning, pressing down like a weight on his back as Jack and Diaz moved east through the canyon. The smoke from the destroyed convoy still clung to their uniforms, mixing with the dust that coated their throats. Every breath felt like it scraped the inside of their lungs. Jack led the way, staying close to the rocks, his eyes scanning for movement. The enemy had scattered after the ambush, but they were still out there searching for survivors, collecting weapons, hunting anything that moved. Diaz limped a few feet behind, trying not to slow him down. He was young, barely 20, his helmet dented, his courage dented even more. But he kept going. Because Jack kept going. They reached a bend in the canyon where the wind carried faint voices, foreign, sharp, confident. Jack raised a hand. They crouched low, pressed against the stone wall. 3 men appeared ahead, moving along the ridge, rifles slung over their shoulders. Jack signaled Diaz to stay put. He crawled forward, his boots silent in the dirt. The Marines were outnumbered, but not outmatched. One mistake could end it all, though, and he couldn't afford another loss. Not after last night. He waited until the first enemy soldier passed, then struck quick and silent. The fight lasted seconds. When it was over, Jack dragged the bodies out of sight. Diaz stared, shaken, but Jack's expression didn't change. There was no triumph, no anger. Just focus. They took what supplies they could, some water, a few rounds, a broken radio. Diaz tried it, tapping the receiver, but only static answered. Jack looked toward the horizon. "We'll keep trying," he said. By noon, the canyon opened into a wide valley of scorched earth. The wind carried the smell of burned oil and blood. Jack could see tire tracks, boot prints, and drag marks leading toward the hills. "They took Wilson that way," Diaz whispered. Jack nodded. "Then we follow." They moved carefully, following the signs like ghosts through the heat shimmer. Occasionally they found pieces of gear, a torn glove, a bent dog tag, a trail of blood half buried in sand. Each one hit Jack harder than the last. These weren't just clues, they were pieces of men he had fought beside. After hours of silence, Diaz spoke. "Sir, why do you think you survived the blast?" Jack didn't answer at first. He kept walking, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I didn't," he said finally. "Not the part that mattered." Diaz looked confused, but he didn't ask again. There was something about Jack's tone, a quiet weight that didn't belong to the living. As the sun began to sink, they reached an abandoned outpost, half-collapsed walls, a rusted watchtower, and empty supply crates. Jack ordered Diaz to rest while he searched. Inside one of the huts, he found something that made his pulse quicken, a torn American patch and a blood-stained boot. Wilson's. He stepped outside, holding it up. "He was here." Diaz's face brightened, but Jack's didn't. There was too much blood for comfort. Still, he clung to hope. In war, hope wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. They camped in silence as night fell, taking turns on watch. The stars came out one by one, cold and clear. Jack sat with his back to the wall, his rifle resting across his lap, his thoughts drifting to the faces of the men he'd lost. He remembered the night before deployment, the laughter, the promises. He remembered Wilson showing him a picture of his newborn daughter. "I'm gonna make it back for her first birthday," he'd said. Now, that voice echoed in Jack's head like a vow left unfinished. Near midnight, Diaz stirred. "Sir?" he whispered. "You think he's still alive?" Jack looked out into the dark. "He better be. Because I'm not going home without him." Just then, faint light flickered in the distance, a campfire, small but visible. Jack adjusted his binoculars. He saw silhouettes, moving men guarding something. And between them, barely visible, was a figure tied to a post. Wilson. Jack's heart kicked hard in his chest. He didn't need to say a word. Diaz saw his face and understood. They packed quietly, double-checked their weapons, and began to crawl across the open plain. The night was their ally now. Every inch forward was a risk. One wrong sound could bring a dozen rifles down on them. But Jack didn't stop. He'd already walked through fire. A few more shadows wouldn't break him. As they drew closer, the camp came into focus. 4 guards, a single truck, and 1 wounded Marine chained near the flames. Wilson's head hung low, but his chest rose and fell. He was alive. Barely. Jack pressed his hand to Diaz's shoulder. We wait for the wind. Then we move. Minutes passed. The air shifted, carrying dust and whispers. Jack raised his rifle and whispered the same words he'd said in every hopeless fight before this one. On my mark, we bring him home. The wind rose, carrying a sharp chill through the valley as Jack and Diaz crept closer to the camp. The fire crackled ahead, its light casting long shadows that danced across the dirt. Jack's heart pounded not from fear, but from focus. Every move, every breath, had to be measured. 2 guards sat near the flames, their rifles resting carelessly at their sides. Another circled the prisoner, while a 4th kept watch near the truck. Jack studied their patterns, the way the sentries moved, the rhythm of their shifts. He'd done this before, too many times. But this time wasn't about strategy. This time was personal. He waited for the right moment. When the guard by the truck turned his back, Jack whispered, "Now." They moved as one. Silent. Swift. Jack took the left flank while Diaz crawled toward the campfire, low and invisible in the darkness. The first guard never saw him coming. A quick strike, a muffled sound, and the man dropped. Jack pressed forward, his knife glinting once before disappearing again into shadow. Then everything went wrong. Diaz stepped on a shard of glass, the faint crack echoing through the camp. The last guard spun around, shouting in his language. Gunfire erupted. Jack dove for cover, bullets slicing the air above him. He returned fire, quick and precise, dropping 2 men before they could reload. The last one ducked behind the truck, shouting for help that wouldn't come. Jack didn't hesitate. He charged. The enemy raised his weapon, but Jack was faster. They collided, the rifle clattering away, the 2 men grappling in the dirt. It ended as fast as it began, with silence. When it was over, Jack's hands trembled as the adrenaline faded. He turned toward the post where Wilson hung. Diaz was already there, cutting through the ropes. "Wilson!" Jack said, his voice breaking for the first time. The wounded Marine lifted his head slowly. His face was bruised, eyes sunken, lips cracked from thirst. When he saw Jack, his expression twisted, half relief, half disbelief. "Jack?" he rasped. "You're supposed to be dead." Jack almost laughed. "You're one to talk." They got him free, easing him to the ground. Wilson's body was weak, his breath shallow. Jack handed him water, holding the canteen steady. "Easy. Just a little." Diaz looked around nervously. "Sir, they'll come looking. We need to move." Jack nodded. "We will. Just give him a minute." He checked the horizon. The stars were fading, a sign that dawn was close. They had to be gone before light hit the valley. Wilson tried to stand, but his leg buckled. Jack caught him, slinging one of Wilson's arms over his shoulder. "You walk when you can. I carry when you can't." Wilson shook his head weakly. "You can't carry me through that canyon, Jack." "Not again." Jack's jaw tightened. "Watch me." They moved out before sunrise, heading west toward the ridges where the terrain offered cover. Every step was a struggle, Wilson fading in and out, Diaz scanning for movement, Jack calculating every direction at once. His body screamed for rest, but his mind wouldn't let him stop. As the sun climbed, the air grew hotter. The canyon walls reflected the heat like an oven, turning every breath into fire. Jack felt Wilson's weight drag heavier with each mile, but he refused to slow down. When they finally reached a shaded outcrop, they rested. Diaz passed around the last of the water. Wilson sipped, then looked at Jack with tired eyes. "Why'd you come back?" Jack didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon. "Because leaving you wasn't an option." Wilson gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." "Maybe," Jack said softly. "But I still get the job done." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. The quiet didn't last long. Diaz froze suddenly, pointing toward the distance. Dust. Movement. Trucks, 2, maybe 3, coming fast. Jack's stomach dropped. They'd found the camp. Wilson tried to rise again, panic flashing in his eyes. Jack steadied him. "No. We move. Now." They pushed on, deeper into the canyon. The sound of engines grew louder behind them. Jack knew they couldn't outrun vehicles on foot. Not with Wilson in his condition. They needed another plan. He remembered the maps he'd studied before the mission, a dry riverbed cutting through the western edge of the cliffs. If they reached it, they could follow it north toward the extraction zone. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. By the time they reached the riverbed, the sun was high overhead. The roar of engines echoed through the canyon walls, bouncing closer. Jack motioned for them to take cover behind a large boulder. The first truck appeared minutes later, soldiers spilling out, weapons raised. Jack held his breath as they passed barely 20 feet away. One wrong move, one sound, and it would be over. Wilson whispered, "You should go. Leave me." Jack shook his head. "Not happening. But if they find us, they won't." Wilson looked at him with disbelief and admiration. "You'd really die for me, wouldn't you?" Jack's voice was low, steady. "No. I'd live for you. That's harder." The trucks moved on, the noise fading into the distance. Jack waited another minute, then helped Wilson up. "We keep moving." As they started again, Diaz asked quietly, "Sir, do you think we'll make it?" Jack didn't look back. "We already made it this far. That means we're not done yet." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a much darker journey, one that would test every ounce of strength he had left. The canyon stretched endlessly ahead, carved by centuries of wind and time. Every step echoed against the stone walls, a reminder of how far they still had to go. The sun beat down without mercy, and the air shimmered in the heat. Jack could feel his strength fading, his shoulders aching beneath Wilson's weight. Yet he refused to stop. Diaz checked the compass and frowned. "We're off course. The extraction point's farther north than we thought." Jack squinted toward the horizon. "We'll correct when the ground evens out. No open trails. We stick to the shadows." The three men pressed forward, following the riverbed as it twisted through the cliffs. Their boots sank into the fine dust, leaving prints that vanished with each gust of wind. Jack's throat burned with thirst, but he ignored it. Every time he looked at Wilson, his face pale, his breath shallow, it reminded him why they were here. As dusk approached, the canyon cooled. The light turned golden, then dimmed to gray. They stopped only long enough to catch their breath. Diaz took watch while Jack checked Wilson's bandages. The wound was worse than he'd hoped. Infection had set in. "Hang on, Marine," Jack whispered, tearing a strip from his sleeve to reinforce the dressing. "We're getting you home." Wilson stirred. His voice was weak but steady. "You sound too sure of that." Jack managed a faint smile. "I have to be. Otherwise, what's the point?" A sudden echo snapped his head up, metal against rock. Diaz was already raising his rifle. They froze, listening. Then it came again. Voices. Foreign. Close. Jack motioned for silence. He scanned the ridgeline until he saw them, 3 figures moving cautiously through the canyon, flashlights sweeping the dark. Scouts. They couldn't afford to be seen. Jack whispered, "Move into the gap. Stay low." They slid into a narrow crevice between the rocks just as the lights drew near. The soldiers spoke in short bursts, scanning the ground. One paused near their tracks. Jack's heartbeat thundered in his ears. If the man looked closer, it would all be over. Then, a crack of thunder rolled across the valley, distant but deep. The soldiers stopped, startled. A storm was brewing. Jack silently prayed it would come faster. Lightning flickered across the sky, followed by a cold wind that swept through the canyon. Dust swirled. The scouts called out to one another, voices rising as they hurried back toward their trucks. When they were gone, Jack let out the breath he'd been holding. "We move now," he said, "before the rain hides the trail." Within minutes, the storm broke. Rain poured in sheets, turning the dry earth to mud. They trudged through it, half blinded, soaked to the bone, but alive. By the time they reached the canyon's edge, night had fallen completely. They found shelter beneath an overhang, where they could finally stop and breathe. Diaz lit a small flame to warm their hands. Wilson shivered, teeth chattering. "You ever think maybe we weren't meant to make it back?" Jack stared into the fire, his expression hard. "Then I'll change what was meant to be." Diaz glanced at him. "Sir, why risk it all for one man? You've done more than anyone could expect." Jack's jaw clenched. "Because when I look at him, I see all the ones we couldn't bring home. Not again." The rain continued to fall, steady and cold. It drowned out the silence of the canyon, washing the blood and dust from their skin but not from their memories. Later, when the storm softened, Wilson whispered, "You know, Jack, I used to dream about home. But somewhere along the way, I stopped. I couldn't see it anymore." Jack turned toward him. "Then let's get you there so you can start dreaming again." Wilson smiled faintly before drifting to sleep. Jack sat awake, watching the horizon. His mind wandered back to the faces of his fallen brothers, the ones whose names were carved into the stone memorials back home. Men he'd laughed with, fought beside, buried with his own hands. He'd promised himself he wouldn't fail another. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke again. Enemy fires may be miles away. But in this war, miles meant nothing. It could all close and within moments. Jack whispered into the darkness, "You're not taking him. Not tonight." Somewhere deep inside, a new resolve formed. No matter how broken, how lost, or how tired he became, he would carry Wilson through hell itself if that's what it took. And as dawn began to creep across the sky once more, Jack knew the worst was still waiting ahead. The journey wasn't over. It was only about to get harder. By morning, the canyon had turned into a maze of mud and fog. The rain hadn't just soaked the ground, it had erased every path, every footprint, every sense of direction. The air was thick, heavy, and eerily quiet. Jack's boots squelched with every step, and his muscles screamed for rest. But stopping wasn't an option. Not now. Wilson leaned heavily against him, his arms slung over Jack's shoulders. His breathing was shallow, his words barely whispers. "You should have left me back there." Jack shook his head. "And break my promise? Not happening." Diaz trudged behind them, scanning the horizon with tired eyes. "Sir, we're burning daylight and we've got no food, no water, and no signal. If command doesn't find us soon—" Jack cut him off. "They'll find us. They have to." He didn't believe it, not completely, but he said it anyway. Because in war, belief sometimes mattered more than truth. Hours passed. The canyon opened into a barren plateau, the kind of place where everything looked the same. The sky was gray, the land endless. Jack guided them toward a line of distant hills, hoping for cover or some trace of the old trail. As they walked, his vision blurred. 2 days with almost no sleep. His body was running on instinct now. He caught himself stumbling once, then twice, but forced his legs to move. Then he saw it, something half buried in the dirt. Metal, glinting faintly under the weak light. He bent down and brushed it clean. It was a dog tag. But not just any tag. He froze when he read the name. Private Sam Keller. Jack's breath caught. Keller had been one of theirs, a young Marine who'd been captured weeks ago and never found. They'd all assumed he was gone. Wilson looked up weakly. "Keller, you knew him?" Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah. I did. Diaz frowned. If his tag's here, maybe. Jack didn't let him finish. He already knew what it meant. The enemy was close. Maybe Keller hadn't died right away. Maybe they'd moved through this area days before. And maybe, just maybe, they'd come back. Jack's senses sharpened. We can't stay here. Move. They crossed the plateau, ducking between rocks and ridges. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound made Jack's pulse quicken. Then, just beyond the next rise, they saw something, black smoke curling into the sky. Wilson's voice cracked. A village? Could be, Jack said. Could also be a trap. They crept closer until the shapes came into focus. Burned-out huts, charred vehicles, and silence. Jack motioned for Diaz to circle left. He stepped into the center of the ruins, scanning for movement. Then he saw it, a body slumped against a wall. American uniform. Jack rushed forward, kneeling beside him. It wasn't Keller, but another Marine, one of the missing patrol members from 3 weeks ago. His gear was gone, and his throat was marked by rope. Jack clenched his fists. They executed him. Diaz's voice trembled. Sir, we need to leave. Whoever did this could still be nearby. Jack stared at the lifeless face for a moment longer, then whispered, We'll come back for you. He pulled the man's tags and slipped them into his pocket. Another promise. Another weight to carry. As they turned to leave, Wilson suddenly tensed. Jack, listen. In the distance, voices. Shouting. Vehicles. Jack's heart sank. They'd been spotted. Go! He barked. Head for the ridge! They ran, Jack half dragging Wilson, Diaz covering their retreat. Bullets ripped through the air, snapping past them. The ground erupted around their feet. Jack felt a sting on his arm, a graze, but didn't slow down. They reached the ridge and dropped behind cover, breathing hard. Jack fired a few shots, forcing the attackers to take cover of their own. He could hear them shouting orders. We can't stay pinned here, Diaz said, reloading. Jack scanned the terrain. The ridge sloped down into another canyon, narrower this time. That way. Go! They slid down the rocky slope, kicking up dirt and gravel. Jack hit the bottom hard, wincing as pain shot through his leg. He pulled Wilson close again. You still with me? Wilson nodded faintly. Barely. Good. Stay that way. They ran until the sound of gunfire faded behind them. When they finally stopped, Jack's chest heaved with exhaustion. He leaned against a boulder, eyes closed for a moment. Diaz broke the silence. Sir, we can't keep doing this. We're out of ammo, and Wilson can't walk much longer. Jack looked at Wilson, his brother in arms, his responsibility. We'll find a way. There's always a way. Wilson managed a tired smile. You sound like you believe it. Jack stared at the horizon. I have to. For a while, none of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the canyon. Then, faintly in the distance, something new. The whir of a helicopter. Diaz's eyes widened. Sir, you hear that? Jack tilted his head, hope stirring for the first time in days. Yeah. That's ours. He grabbed the signal flare from his pack, his hands trembling as he pulled the pin. The flare hissed to life, shooting a streak of red smoke into the sky. They waited. Seconds felt like hours. Then, through the haze, the helicopter appeared, small at first, then growing larger. Wilson exhaled weakly. We made it. But Jack's gut told him something was wrong. The chopper wasn't slowing down, it was circling, uncertain. And behind them, echoing off the canyon walls, came the sound of engines. Trucks. The enemy was coming again. Jack looked from the helicopter to his wounded friend, then to the ridge behind them. Not yet, he muttered. We're not done yet. And as he reloaded his last magazine, he realized something deep down. Surviving wasn't the hardest part. Keeping his brothers alive, that was the real fight. The canyon darkened as night approached, the sky streaked with the last light of day. Jack helped Wilson to a shallow depression between two rocks, letting him rest while Diaz scouted the perimeter. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound made Jack's nerves tighten. They were exposed, tired, and vulnerable, but he refused to give in to fear. Wilson's breathing was shallow, uneven. His body trembled with exhaustion and pain. Jack pressed a water bottle to his lips. "Drink slowly. You need every ounce." Diaz glanced back toward the distant ridge. "Sir, we can't stay here long. The chopper may have seen the smoke, but it won't come straight down with all the enemy movement nearby." Jack nodded. "We'll move when it's dark enough to cover us. No mistakes now. We're too close." Hours passed. The three of them huddled together, sharing what little warmth they could. Jack's thoughts drifted back to the patrol he'd lost, Wilson's squad mates, and he wondered how many were gone, how many would never see home again. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier than Wilson's body on his shoulders. By midnight, the enemy trucks had vanished from the horizon. Jack helped Wilson to his feet. "Ready to move?" Wilson coughed weakly, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." They moved slowly, sticking to shadows, keeping low. Jack took the lead, eyes scanning the ground for tripwires, hidden snares, or sudden movements. Diaz followed, then Wilson, leaning on Jack's shoulder for support. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on rock and dirt. The plateau opened into a valley, and Jack spotted a dry riverbed that could provide cover for the next leg of their journey. "Good," he whispered. "That's our path. Keep low and quiet." They moved into the riverbed, the walls of the canyon shielding them from view. The darkness made it easier, but it was still grueling. Wilson's legs shook, his strength fading. Jack adjusted him, half dragging, half carrying him through the rough terrain. Diaz kept watch for movement, scanning the ridges with nervous eyes. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance. "A campfire?" Jack froze, signaling for Diaz and Wilson to stop. He crouched low, binoculars in hand. 3 figures moved near the fire. Enemy soldiers. Jack counted 4 rifles. Too risky to attack. They would have to bypass it entirely. Jack whispered, "We go wide. Follow me, close to the rocks. No mistakes." They detoured, moving silently along a narrow ledge above the camp. Wilson's foot slipped once, but Jack caught him before he fell. Diaz exhaled sharply, but didn't speak. Finally, they cleared the ridge and descended into a shadowed canyon. The enemy camp was behind them now. Jack allowed himself a small, quiet relief, but didn't celebrate. There was still a long way to go. Hours passed, the night deepening. Wilson's condition worsened. Fever had set in, and his strength was draining fast. Jack and Diaz adjusted his grip, whispering encouragement as they pushed on. At the canyon's edge, they spotted what looked like abandoned buildings, possibly supplies, possibly a hiding place for them to rest. They moved cautiously, every step slow, every movement calculated. Inside the shelter, they made Wilson lie down, covering him with a thin tarp from their packs. Jack knelt beside him, feeling his pulse. Weak, but still alive. That was enough for now. Diaz whispered, "Sir, we can't keep going much longer like this. We need extraction help." Jack shook his head. "No. We're not done yet. He makes it home or I die trying. Nothing else matters." Wilson murmured, "Jack, you've already carried me through hell." Jack leaned closer, his voice firm but gentle. "And I'll keep carrying you until the very end. No one gets left behind. Not on my watch." The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant fires. Jack stared into the darkness, his jaw tight, determination hardening like steel. Somewhere far off, a faint hum of engines. He knew reinforcements weren't coming yet. They had to make it on their own. Jack checked their supplies. Nearly empty. No food, almost no water, and their weapons were low. Every instinct screamed that they were close to the edge, but Jack refused to falter. As the first hint of dawn lighted the horizon, he helped Wilson up again. "Come on, Marine. Almost there." We'll see home before today ends. Diaz glanced between them. You really think we can make it? Jack's eyes were hard, unwavering. We have to. Because failure isn't an option. Not for him. Not for any of us. The sun rose behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows. And Jack knew that whatever lay ahead, traps, enemy patrols, exhaustion, would not stop him. He would walk through hell itself if it meant bringing his brother home alive. By mid-morning, the canyon had opened into rolling hills. The terrain was rough but manageable, offering better footing than the riverbed. Jack's muscles screamed with every step, but he refused to slow. Wilson's body was weak, fever burning through him, and Diaz did everything he could to keep him upright. Sir? I don't know how much longer he can last, Diaz said quietly, glancing at Wilson's pale face. Jack shook his head. Then we carry him. Every step, every mile. We don't stop. They moved in silence, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on all three men. Jack's legs were numb, his lungs burned, but he focused on the horizon. Somewhere ahead was the extraction point, a small clearing where a helicopter could land. They had to reach it before nightfall. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, and the heat became unbearable. Wilson's breathing grew shallower, and sweat ran in rivulets down Jack's face. He kept one arm under Wilson, the other holding a makeshift strap to secure him. Diaz walked beside them, keeping a lookout, scanning for any sign of movement. Then they heard it, a distant hum, low and steady. Jack froze. That's not the wind. Diaz's eyes widened. The chopper? Jack nodded slowly. Maybe, but we can't take the risk of being seen by anyone else. Keep your head down. The hum grew louder. Jack scanned the horizon, spotting the small dot of a helicopter in the distance. It was moving too slow, hovering carefully. He signaled Diaz. Prepare to run. We make a dash when it's close enough. Wilson stirred weakly. Jack. I can't, you can, Jack said firmly. You have to. Just a little farther. As the helicopter descended, dust and debris swirled around them. Jack gritted his teeth, lifting Wilson higher onto his shoulders. Every step was agony, but he refused to falter. Diaz ran ahead, waving to guide the pilot. Gunfire erupted behind them, enemy patrols catching up. Jack didn't look back. He focused only on Wilson, on the helicopter, on survival. Bullets whizzed past, but they moved too fast to hit. The helicopter landed just as Jack reached the clearing. The pilot jumped out, taking Wilson from Jack's arms with practiced efficiency. Jack dropped to the ground, chest heaving, and watched as the crew secured him onto a stretcher. Wilson gave a weak smile. You kept your promise. Jack managed a smile back, his voice strained. Always. Diaz collapsed nearby, exhausted but relieved. The pilot called for them to board, and they helped Wilson into the chopper. Jack followed, keeping one hand on Wilson until he was strapped in securely. As the helicopter lifted off, Jack looked down at the canyon they had crossed, the riverbeds, the ridges, the enemy patrols that had almost ended them. He thought of every step, every struggle, every moment he had refused to give up. Wilson looked at him, eyes glistening with tears. You saved me. Jack shook his head. No. We saved each other. The helicopter rose higher, leaving the canyon behind. Jack exhaled, letting the tension drain from his body. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, even just a little. They were alive. Wilson was alive. And they had survived what seemed impossible. Jack looked out the window at the endless landscape, shadows of the canyon still visible beneath them. Somewhere down there, the lives they had left behind, the fallen, the lost, would continue to echo in memory. But for now, they had made it. Against all odds. Against exhaustion, against the enemy, against death itself. And as the helicopter carried them towards safety, Jack knew one thing for certain: no one would ever leave a brother behind while he still had breath in his body. The helicopter cut through the early morning sky, the hum of its blades a constant rhythm. Inside, Wilson lay on the stretcher, pale but conscious. Jack sat beside him, hand resting lightly on his friend's arm. Diaz was close by, keeping watch through the open side door. Wilson's voice was barely a whisper. I can't believe we made it." Jack managed a tired smile. "Neither can I. But we did. You're going home." The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Medics waiting at the base. You're safe now." Jack exhaled, the weight of days without sleep, without food, without rest, finally pressing down on him. He had carried Wilson across canyons, through enemy fire, and over miles of rough terrain. Every step had been a battle, but every step had been worth it. Wilson turned his head, eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." Jack shook his head. "You don't repay anything. You survive, you live. That's enough." Diaz leaned back, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. "Sir? I don't think I've ever seen anyone do what you just did." Jack gave a weary shrug. "We all do what we have to. Today it was him. Tomorrow, someone else." Below them, the base grew larger, medics rushing forward, helicopters on standby, soldiers moving with purpose. Jack felt the exhaustion in his bones, but also a deep sense of fulfillment. The mission had been impossible, but they had succeeded. As the helicopter touched down, Wilson's stretcher was lifted carefully. Jack followed, walking beside him until medics took over. He watched as Wilson was carried into the medical bay, finally safe. Diaz clapped Jack on the shoulder. "You really are something else, sir." Jack said nothing, only watched the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky with gold and crimson, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, light would always return. He thought of the men they had lost, the battles they had fought, and the impossible journey they had survived. And he knew that courage wasn't measured by the battles won, it was measured by the willingness to carry a brother through hell and back. As the helicopter lifted again, Jack looked down at the canyon they had conquered. Every scar in the land, every footprint, every struggle, every life almost lost, it was all part of a story that would not be forgotten. Wilson's voice came again, faint but steady. "Jack, thank you." Jack's lips pressed into a firm line. "No thanks needed. Just live. That's what matters." And as they disappeared into the sky, leaving the battlefield behind, Jack allowed himself a single, quiet thought: no brother left behind, no matter the cost. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, and somewhere below, the echoes of their journey whispered across the canyon walls, a tale of courage, endurance, and unbreakable loyalty that would be remembered long after the dust had settled.